Hi, everybody. This is Marburger back with chapter 29 of Pax. We are so close to the ending. Um, I'm excited, but I'm also kind of sad that it's going to be ending soon, so I'm going to just really try to enjoy these last few chapters. All right, chapter 29. 3 mice swelled Pax's belly, and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. It would feed Bristle and Rump for the whole day. He craved sleep after a long night of hunting, but as usual he trotted a long weaving path home to confuse any possible predators. The trail the bleeding runt had left when they had moved was still strong enough to mark them as vulnerable. The first rays of morning light lit the grasses. A movement caught his eye. Bristle. She was a few full bounds out of the clearing, instead of at the apron of the burrow, where she usually guarded Runt. He watched her bounce up in a mock alarm and then tumble kicking into the grass. Then he saw an even more surprising sight. Runt's small head bobbed up. Runt was outside, and he was playing. Pax dropped the muskrat. He called to Bristle, and Runt turned his head. Pax called again, testing, and Runt answered. He could hear! Pax was washed with a relief so overwhelming that he could not move for a moment, and where he had once cared for only one boy, he now brimmed with love for his bristling vixen and her ragged brother, and they were safe. He streaked across the clearing. Bristle and Runt parted to welcome him into the space between them. He dropped onto his back, and Runt toppled onto them. Pax rolled Runt over gently, listening for any whimper of pain, and he only heard purrs of delight. For an hour the foxes played. Runt rested often, and whenever he did, the other two stopped and flanked him. Like the buttercups beside them, the 3 foxes' faces lifted to the morning sun, until Bristle leaped to her feet. Her nostrils flared. Pax smelled it too, the same threatening scent that had made him anxious for 2 days. But this was no longer a faint threat in the air. This odor was strong and growing stronger. Coyote. Bristle jumped toward the den, pivoted toward the clearing, and then jumped back to Runt. Pax had never seen her so panicked. At that instant all 3 foxes perked their ears sharply to the same spot in the woods, to the careless branch rustling of a creature that did not need the advantage of stealth. Heading north, up from the gorge, heading for the clearing. The coyote was following Runt's trail. Bristle nosed her brother upright and screamed at Pax, "Guard him!" Pax herded Runt back to the den. Pacing the entrance, he watched Bristle head toward the rustling, stiff-legged and wary, and then stopped. She pricked her ear, her rump high. And then, in front of her, at the precise place where the junipers were still compressed from dragging Runt in, a dark, brindle coyote emerged, his head to the ground. Bristle barked. The coyote's head snapped up. Bristle barked again and jumped into the clearing. The coyote cocked his head and then took a step toward her, then lowered his nose to Runt's trail again. Deep instinct urged Pax to run away. The coyote was a tall, heavily muscled male. A fox was no match for an animal that large and aggressive. But a deeper instinct reminded him that Runt was defenseless in the burrow. Bristle ignored the instinct to flee as well, and instead she tore straight toward the coyote, lunging at his flank. The coyote spun and snapped, just clipping Bristle's back foot. She limped into the clearing, whining as if she'd been injured. The coyote studied her, but then he shook himself, recognizing the ploy, and he dropped to the scent again. Bristle flew back. She jumped in front of the coyote's path and faced him, her spine arched. From her throat came a hoarse howl Pax had never heard before, and for an instant the coyote pulled back, seeming surprised that this small animal was engaging him. And then he bunched his shoulders into attack position, and he bared his teeth. Pax's body stiffened. A growl rattled in his throat. Runt whimpered in the den. The coyote sprang at Bristle and knocked her to the ground, and for a moment Pax saw nothing but fur and teeth flashing in the grass, and heard only yips and growls. But then Bristle scrambled out of the coyote's hold. She leaped again toward the center of the clearing, a single leap only. Pax understood that she was luring him away from Runt. Staying just out of his reach, she baited the coyote until she reached the sweet gum tree. Then, just as Pax had done, she leaped up onto the slant of the trunk. She padded out onto the lower first branch carefully, never taking her eyes off the growling coyote who followed on the ground. And when she reached the spot where the branch split, she was well over his head. She hissed a taunt. The coyote jumped. He clawed only bark and leaves. He circled in the hollow under the branch, looking for higher ground, and then jumped again. And this time his forepaws caught the branch and held for an instant before he fell back. He gathered himself, and he leaped again. Pax saw that Bristle was as far out on the limb as she could go. The coyote would tear her from the tree soon, or grow impatient with her distractions and then return to the trail she had diverted him from. She would follow and fight until he ripped her apart. "Stay!" Pax ordered Runt, and he tore across the clearing. Whew! Great chapter. So Pax is telling Runt to stay. He's going to go help Bristle. I'm going to read chapter 32. Peter stared. There had been a birch tree by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the pirate tree because in the fall bright yellow leaves made it look covered in gold coins. He had tied Pax to its trunk once when the kit hadn't liked their war play. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else, except the mill itself, was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted and splintered into logs. Great patches of grasses around them were scorched to ash, and the bank was littered with crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most to look at was the water. The last time he had been here, he had dived into the pool at the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling and clear that he had been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales on the trouts, and even when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonflies winged skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. Now muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The broad flat of the river was half its usual breadth. Mud flats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. The right side, he added indignantly. Boy, Vola had said, and then boy, again to make sure he had his attention. Do you think anyone in the history of this world ever set out to fight for the wrong side? The wind picked up and howled across the field, stirring eddies of ash. Peter tried to imagine playing here again. It would be a long time before anyone would ever want to play here. Vultures, wheeling silently above him, were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were encircling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal that I had interrupted. A meal that might be... Peter couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been here, he could be dead now. And if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. They hovered over 3 distinct spots, the one beside him and the 2 across the river. Slow and lazy, in no hurry, their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack, freed of the weight. He swung down to the hemlock bough in only a few steps. Trailing from beneath it was the sight he was dreading, a foxtail, its white-tipped brush unmistakable, and he lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt remained, and it wasn't red. It wasn't red. It wasn't Pax. He took a ragged breath, dizzy with relief. He pegged down to the river and waded in it. And when he was waist high, the crutches skidded out on the mud-slimed stones, so he spared them over the far bank and dived in. And for the first time in almost 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank, out of the water, The soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and he hacked at it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw the larger group of vultures. It was circling a corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he had seen in Vola's field. You humans, you ruin everything, and turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the third spot he had sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first there seemed to be nothing on the charred ground, but when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg, fleshless and singed, but still he knew it was a hind leg, a slim, black-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift of fur at the top was a bright crimson. A fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Maybe it was too small to be Pax's. He wished he could know, and then he took back the wish. What did it matter anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some humans had obliterated that life. Wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. Peter dropped to the ground. He swept a circle bare of rubble, and his hands brushed something that turned the breath in his lungs to ash. A toy soldier. Sighting down the barrel of a rifle, pressed tight to his hard green cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter keeled over. Pax. Great chapter. So he's pretty certain now that it was Pax's hind leg. And we know that it wasn't, but he doesn't know that. And he is heartbroken and devastated. That soldier was a huge clue for him, at least what he thinks was a huge clue. Two great chapters. All right, thanks for listening.